Chapter 3. On New Year's Day in Tokyo Detention House, the prisoners are served ozoni soup and red and white manju, as well as a tiered bento box containing a selection of ochi. The contents vary slightly according to the budget, but this year it's likely to be deep-fried chicken, nishim, pork kakuni, grilled fish, simmered prawns, kazunoko, yokon, daimaki, pink and white kamaboko, curry kintin, kuromame, and fruit. It's the only day of the year when they're served pure white rice, rather than rice mixed with barley. I hope this coming year treats you well. The first message that Rika received in the new year was this one from Shinoi. She poked her head out from the gap between the down duvet and the futon, which was thin enough that she could feel the hardness of the floor beneath. She reached for her phone, which lay beside her pillow. She smiled as she read the text, clearly written by someone and used to composing messages that weren't strictly business-related. The sunlight filtering through the blinds declared the start of an as-yet unblemished new year. She was pleased that Shinoi had remembered her request. She brought up the keyboard to reply, then decided to do it in the evening. For today, at least, she wanted to avoid any kind of rushed communication. Tomorrow she would be going back into work. It was now 10 a.m. By the time she got here last night, the annual Kahaku New Year's Song Contest had already finished, and it was a few minutes before the TV began to show the ceremonial ringing of the bell. Seeing her daughter somewhat unsteady from drinking, her mother had smiled and rolled her eyes, and presented her with a small bowl of New Year's Eve tashikoshi soba, topped with a piece of yuzu rind. Rika had soaked in the hot bath until she was filmed by a faint sweat, and then slept for over 9 hours beside her mother and her occasional teeth grinding. Even that was sufficient to make her feel like her body, ground down by the spate of end-of-year parties, had been restored to life. Would Kajii be satisfied by the taste of the ochi she'd be served in the detention house, presumably now for the third time? Staring up at the unfamiliar ceiling, Rika tried to picture the scene, aided by the contents of the message she'd just received. According to her past blog entries, when the year began to draw to a close, Kajii and her younger sister would set about preparing the various dishes that made up the ochi served in multi-tiered bento boxes. Added to this repertoire would be the traditional dishes particular to the Niigata region, such as nop, a simmered vegetable stew made with taro and shiitake, and hizunumasu, pickled cartilage from the salmon's head. To make the ozoni mochi soup that was a must on New Year's Day, she would use her grandmother's recipe with salmon and cod roe, plenty of strong dashi, and lots of vegetables. Just the thought of those small plump white hands carefully simmering and grilling all the ingredients roused a sense of hunger in Rika. She got up and folded her futon, then looked around at the apartment in which her mother lived alone. She hadn't been to visit since the previous New Year. A Jean Moreau film poster, a photo book showing stylish elderly women walking around New York, a vase with some haphazardly arranged orchids, a few jazz records. She saw now a similarity between her mother's apartment and Reiko's house. Hadn't she read somewhere that people unconsciously selected close friends of a similar personality type to their mothers? As it happened, Reiko and Rika's mother got along very well. Compared to Rika herself, who was so sloppy when it came to her domestic environment, both women had a distinctive sense of style and created an environment where they could be surrounded by things that they liked, aspects of themselves that they put to use in their working lives too. Rika's mother still worked 3 days a week in the Jugawaka branch of her shop, a boutique aimed at women in their 50s and 60s that sold a wide range of items from clothes to imported knickknacks and interior goods. There was no sign of her mother in the apartment. On the round IKEA table lay a note reading, "Happy New Year. I've gone to visit Granddad. Come along when you're up. Remember to lock the door." Her mother's rent was 78,000 yen per month. The fact that her mother, who would turn 62 this year, was living in a place ever so slightly cheaper and smaller than her own would sometimes cause a prickling in Rika's chest. However much Rika tried to convince her, though, her mother wouldn't accept any money from her. She was adamant in her stance that a woman never knows what's going to happen in life. "If you've got the money to give me," she would say, "I'd far rather you put it in your own savings." When Rika's grandfather died, she said she would think about using his inheritance to see about getting somewhere more permanent, but until then she was fine living in this place. Even now, when business was on track, her mother would never spend unnecessarily. Nobody would ever guess to look at them, but all the items of furniture and objects in this flat were bought from mass retailers, antiques got on the cheap, or gifts she'd been given. Her parents' divorce, which had occurred when Rika was just starting at a private middle school, had gone through on the condition that the only money they'd receive from her father were monthly maintenance payments. And so Rika had never once been on holiday with her mother. Perhaps because her school was relatively laid-back and unpretentious, and the fees weren't extortionate, she has no memory of them ever struggling to get by. The one-bedroom apartment in Hatanadai that the two of them had shared until Rika left university was smaller than her mother's current flat, and the rent had been 62,000 yen a month. When Rika had eventually discovered how little her mother had been earning at that time, she'd been shocked. Rika got changed and slowly drank a glass of water. Her grandfather and uncle's family lived in the red brick apartment block, which she could see from the window. It was now 12 years since Rika's grandparents had sold their house and come to live in this spot, 10 minutes walk from Okusawa Station. Rika's grandfather, who was about to turn 93, was still physically mobile, but since he'd begun showing the early signs of dementia, he'd started finding aspects of daily life more challenging. These days he relied on Rika's mother and Rika's uncle's family for support, alongside his care workers. Rika's mother and her aunt, her mother's younger brother's wife, had long been on excellent terms and referred to one another affectionately as Misaki-chan and Echin. Although her mother was staying over at her grandfather's place more of late, she seemed to have no intention of giving up her own apartment, saying she wanted to keep hold of a space that was all her own. Rika heard the sound of the key in the door. Poking her head out of the kitchen, she saw her mother come in, taking off her coat. She had a patterned scarf wrapped around her head and wore a black turtleneck together with chunky jewelry of a bold design. Her mother was always dressed so chicly that she often looked out of place. "What's happened?" "I was about to head over." "It's okay, you don't have to go." Grandpa lost his temper, and it's impossible with everyone there trying to soothe him. He's put his duvet over his head and won't come out. Her mother laid a package down on the table. "Some mochi for you." She moved in front of the extractor fan and lit a cigarette. Through the thin veil of smoke, her profile looked exhausted. It seems he took offense to the ochi that Echin bought in the department store. He kept going on about how Grandma used to make it herself, standards were slipping, and so on. Then he said that it was no wonder I ended up divorced. If it was Echin who bought them, why does he take it out on you and not her? Without answering, Mother pointed to the package on the table. "Do you want to grill them?" Apparently they're fresh ones that he ordered from the local confectioners. Rika's grandfather was judicious in his treatment of Rika's aunt, but had never showed any mercy towards his own daughter. The tendency had grown even more pronounced after her divorce. There was no denying that, until a few years before her death, Rika's grandmother had made the time-consuming ochi from scratch, from kuromame, simmered black beans, to the daimaki, omelette rolls. Unlike Rika's mother, her grandmother had been a talented cook, but back then Rika hadn't really appreciated the fact and had simply eaten her ochi out of habit. Suddenly, a scene came flooding back to her. It was the New Year's Eve of her final year at primary school, and her father had stormed out of the house. He'd taken a dislike to the kamo-siro, chilled soba noodles with chicken dipping sauce, that her mother had made. Her father, an English literature professor, had grown up spoiled and was still fussy when it came to food. He was forever finding something to complain about in Rika's mother's slapdash cooking. When Rika had told people about the episode in the past, they'd attempted to dress it up as a pleasant memory, saying, "Wow, your dad was a real foodie," or similar. In reality, though, her memory of that New Year's Eve, which should by rights have been spent with the whole family sitting in front of the television, laughing together, but which had suddenly turned so that the air grew tense and her mother began to cry, was such that even bringing fragments of it to mind now caused her stomach to tense up. Rika had disliked kamo-siro ever since. Rika's mother had formerly been a pupil of her father's. Back when the student protests had been in full swing, her father had been an idol to his students, the young professor kicking back against the system. The two of them had ignored the vehement disapproval of her parents, and their marriage was practically an elopement. And there was she, thinking that both she and her mother had long ago escaped the kind of icy tension that used to descend upon the dinner table loaded with dishes of her home-cooked food. Echen was saying that a kid she works with sprinkles sugar and soy sauce on her toasted mochi and finishes it off with a slice of butter. Don't you think that's disgusting? Apparently, it's how the younger generation like to eat them these days. Butter, eh. Rika felt the inside of her cheeks puckering and saliva welling up slowly in her mouth. She knew by now that the taste of butter in combination with any kind of carbohydrate was one of inexplicable fullness. There was no way that the trick wouldn't work with mochi too. Rika washed her hands, then arranged the smooth, pre-cut mochi dusted with rice flour inside the toaster. Grandpa's just grumpy because his care worker doesn't come at New Year. The one he's got at the moment is a pretty young girl who listens and nods to whatever he says, and he's grown ever so fond of her. He was getting all excited telling me about how the two of them were going to go on a date. Rika opened the fridge to find it sparkling clean and, like her own, on the bare side. On the shelf was a jar of koi butter. When she opened the lid, a fresh, sweet scent rose up to greet her. She found the image of her grandfather, whom she had once loved so much, coming together in her head with Manako Kajii's victims in a way that made her feel quite melancholy. Watching the corners of the mochi slowly filling out against the toaster's crimson-lit insides, mother and daughter fell quiet. Rika recalled again the conversation she'd had with Shinoi. The variety of species on Earth is in continual flux because most species are incapable of truly adapting to their environment and are consequently wiped out. It's not that the species that manage to survive the process of natural selection form the minority, it's that those who are wiped out form the majority. Extinction is a crucial phenomenon. Seen through the long lens of human history, the fact that Rika and her grandfather were alive simultaneously was an unnatural state of affairs. The mochi gradually began to take on color and swell out. When their skin seared with brown grill marks started to split open, revealing glimpses of their sparkling white insides, Rika took them out of the toaster. She perched a generous wedge of butter on top of each and prepared the sugared soy sauce in a small dish. Watching as the molten butter flowed gently over both the burnished surface and the soft white interior, her stomach rumbled. Though she knew it was bad manners to eat standing up, she stuffed one of the mochi in her mouth right there at the counter. The heady aroma that rose up through her nose, the crispiness of the skin as it broke open beneath her teeth, the silkiness of the gooey insides that spread themselves flat across every bit of flesh in her mouth and refused to let go. The hot butter fused the sugar and soy sauce together, clinging to the sweet, soft, shapeless mass in her mouth, swimming around its outside as though to ascertain its contours. The grease of the butter melded with the grit of the sugar and the pungent soy sauce. By the time she'd finished chewing, the roots of her teeth were trembling pleasurably. Rika said with a sigh, "I can see how you could get addicted to this combination." "I'll grill some more, shall I?" 4, 6. "Didn't you say you've got a sensitive stomach after all the end-of-year parties?" her mother said, her eyes widening as she watched Rika loading up the still-warm toaster with more mochi. Once we've eaten these, shall we have an outing?" Rika said. "We could do our New Year's shrine visit at the Megura Fudo Temple and then go for coffee somewhere." Rika knew from experience that, at times like these, the best strategy was to lead her mother away somewhere in order to take her mind off things. She couldn't keep track of the number of times that she'd witnessed the tragic sight of her mother, hurt by something her grandfather or father had said, trying to recover her equilibrium without letting anyone notice that she'd been affected. Her mother still seemed somewhat dazed, but she assented to the plan, donning again the coat that she'd taken off and stumbling outside. The two of them piled into the back seat of a taxi they'd hailed on the street and, after telling the driver their destination, Rika said very casually to her mother, "Isn't it hard, having Grandpa taking things out on you like that? I know he's going senile and everything, but still." Of course it is. It's exasperating. Thank goodness I don't live with him, and he's got Etchin and the care worker as well, so it doesn't get me down too much. But I don't know what would happen if it were just the two of us. I'm sure that would sound pathetic to all those people caring for their parents full-time. Rika was still listening to her mother, making the appropriate responses and helping her to purge her frustration when the taxi pulled up in front of an expensive apartment building, complete with a concierge. Located along a cherry tree-lined street very close to Meguro Fudome. When her mother shot her a look of confusion, Rika whispered playfully in her ear, "This is the building where Manako Kajii was living. I've been wanting to come and look at it when I had a moment. Apparently the rent's 300,000 yen a month. I was wondering what had got into you." "So this outing of ours is all work-related," then, her mother asked indignantly, but it was clear that she was already on the way to casting off her earlier sadness. "You mean that food fanatic who defrauded all those men from dating sites, right? Wow, quite a spot she chose for herself. Paid for with the money she extorted from them, I suppose. Impressive." Just like Reiko, Rika's mother had a healthy curiosity and was fascinated by whatever was making a splash in the news. Her tone now was high-spirited, and together they stared at the well-tended flower beds outside the building, the New Year's decorations, and the art object made out of driftwood adorning its glass-fronted entrance, which made it appear more like an art museum than a residential building. Even when a resident came out and gave them a withering stare, Rika's prevailing feeling was still one of relief that her mother's mood had shifted. She looked up again at the 12-story apartment block, this time with the eyes of a journalist. It was certainly opulent in its construction, but it was the kind of building she often came across when covering celebrities and sports stars. There was nothing about it that promised to reveal a new aspect to Kajii's personality. For what Rika understood Kajii's tastes to be, it seemed lacking in individuality and overly contemporary, with very little about it that struck her as distinctive. Mother and daughter walked around the outside of the building, in the direction of the Meguro Fudo Temple. In the temple heaving with people, they lined up to make their New Year's prayer and drank the warm amazake being served. By the time they came to draw their fortunes for the year ahead, written on slips of paper, any sense of tension had disappeared. On their way to Meguro Station, they passed by a fruit parlor, and recalling the taste of the Christmas cake, Rika said, "This place used to be owned by that confectionery company West." It was one of Kajii's favorite spots. There was a closed for the holidays sign up in the shop window. "Was it now?" Rika's mother said, her eyes sparkling. She didn't want to go to Starbucks, she said, because she couldn't smoke there, so instead they entered a doubter by Meguro JR Station. No sooner had she lifted her mug of coffee to her lips when she began talking. "You know, I feel like I can really understand why Manako Kajii was so popular with men. The truth is, you promise you won't mention this to anyone." She giggled like a schoolgirl and leaned across the table to whisper in Rika's ear. What Rika heard nearly made her choke on her mouthful of milk tea. "What? You worked as a decoy at a matchmaking party? I need to hear more about this." "Oh no, I get scared when you get that journalist's face on. You're not writing an article on this, you hear? I told you in confidence." Her mother slid a Mevius cigarette out of the packet and lit it. The request, she told Rika, had come via a friend of hers who worked in a matchmaking company, who she'd initially met as a customer of the shop and had begun occasionally going out for drinks with. The woman pleaded with her, saying that having someone so attractive there really helped the mood, and so Rika's mother had agreed to go out of curiosity. The party, which was limited to people over 60, had taken place in an event venue in a Roppongi hotel. It had been, to borrow her mother's description, utter hell. "I never thought that at this age, I'd be treated like a hostess. When the truth is I wouldn't want to listen to a baby boomer grandpa boasting about all his past triumphs even if I were getting paid for it. Women like me aren't interested in a dazzling list of accolades. We want to meet men who can hold a decent conversation." It wasn't just me who was sickened by it, either. I found two other like-minded souls. As soon as our eyes met, we could tell that we were all feeling the same. When it was over, the three of us went to Amando for tea. I've not been there in ages. When it comes to Roppongi, us women are far more in the know than the men. "That's so you, Mom." Still, I bet that looking the way you do, the men still had the hots for you. That's the thing, not at all. That sort of man isn't looking for a partner with whom they can communicate equally, to share their life with. Nope, what they want is a capable hostess who'll listen to them wittering on. Those women do exist, but most of them are employed by the party hosts. Professionals, in other words. I shouldn't go blurting this around, but apparently these matchmaking parties for seniors are rife with actual prostitutes. They're their main hunting ground. I heard that from the women I went to tea with. I suppose there were a few at the one I was at too. In fact, now I say that, there was a woman who I thought was behaving a bit peculiarly, snuggling up to the men and so forth. Professionals. Wasn't the great tragedy of Kajii's victims that they had mistaken a service, for which they should have paid a professional, with a woman's natural kindness and consideration? I say professional, but you'd never in a million years be able to tell by looking at them. To do that job, you have to look like a regular middle-aged woman. You can't surprise the men or make them feel anything new. And then the men come flocking. And that's okay, no? If they're meeting each other's needs and having a good time, her mother finished dryly, breathing out smoke. Her latest relationship, Rika deduced from this, had now ended. Between her mother's brows lay traces of disappointment that had been formed over decades and were now impossible to erase. Her mother was a highly serious and fastidious person, but was destined to be seen by others as reckless and to suffer as a result. Both Rika's grandfather and father had done nothing but criticize her, but she would laugh it off and end up catering to their selfish whims. Their strategy worked because they knew full well that she was the kind to worry about the feelings of those around her, keep her own feelings inside, and never explode. Housework, work, childcare, and now caring duties. Her mother had always performed a complex juggling act, but had never complained about it, even to Rika. After the divorce, her mother's income had been taken up more or less entirely by the rent for their Hatanadai apartment and their living costs, and for a while her grandfather had covered her school fees. When Rika formulated the idea that she might be the reason that her mother still felt indebted to her grandfather, she felt a rush of guilt. Have you been to visit your dad's grave recently? I've been thinking that I should find the time to, but haven't quite managed it. You should go to see him from time to time. He's your blood relative, after all. I'm nothing but a stranger, and even I went twice last year. Caught off guard by this announcement, which was delivered with the utmost smoothness, Rika stared at her mother. It wasn't as though the subject of her father was taboo between them, but neither was it one they tended to bring up. When her mother had asked for a divorce, her father had been bewildered. His initial reaction was one of childish confusion, and then he'd flown into an uncontrollable rage. Rika was confident that up until that point, he hadn't even imagined that the situation had been stressful for her mother, or that she might want to leave him. She remembered now the sight of her mother's neck and shoulders, filling her field of vision from where she was sitting in the child's seat on the back of the bicycle. As she pedaled up the hill, her top was stretched taut across her sweaty skin, and the nubs of her spine stood right out. While still a full-time homemaker, her mother had used to cycle from library to library, taking out the new novels that her father had reserved. It was not out of the ordinary for her to cycle to 5 libraries in a day. Rika had enjoyed those trips on her mother's bike to the libraries that she so loved, but if her mother failed to pick up even one of his reservations, her father's mood would turn sour and he'd fall silent. So there had always been a desperate quality to her mother's expression. Thinking back on it, it was from that point on that the financial difficulties had begun. Towards the end of Rika's time in primary school, her mother had taken a part-time job in spite of her father's resistance and refused thenceforth to do the library run. After her parents had split, Rika's father had carried on living by himself in the Mitaka apartment where Rika had been born. Apparently misinterpreting Rika's silence as consternation, her mother now said, "What's wrong with that?" "I happened to be on my way back from checking out an import brand in Minato Mirai, so I called into the graveyard in Yokohama. I don't have a single good memory of your father. Do you know, right before your middle school entrance exams, He started saying that he was going to quit his job at the university and dedicate himself to the novel he'd always dreamed of writing. He was really messed up. Did he have any idea how much we suffered? Even in complaining about Rika's late father, there was a lightness to her mother's tone, and her words didn't bring Rika down. Did she really feel as carefree about it as she made out, though? When a sentimental old song came on in the cafe, she snorted with laughter, but then glanced down at her watch, making Rika suspect she was thinking about getting back to her grandfather. It was the evening of the 4th, after the 3 days of official New Year's holiday were over, that Momo Oyasu, owner of the Ginza Members Club Lobby, agreed to an interview with Rika, who was stationed outside her hero apartment. Naturally, she had told Oyasu that the magazine was planning to run a photo of her visiting the Kyocho maternity clinic, as well as a picture of her with the up-and-coming politician who was a regular visitor to the club. "You're certainly determined. Spending your New Year's holidays like this," Oyasu had said in apparent exasperation with Rika, who had been standing outside her apartment since the 2nd, before reluctantly agreeing to talk to her there on the street. Her diminutive figure, like that of a young girl, was swaddled in an expensive-looking coat, and Rika was unable to ascertain whether or not she was showing. Like Rika's mother, she tied back her long hair with a scarf, her bare white forehead gleaming in the dark of the street. A beautiful woman of indeterminate age, there was something about her pointed chin and the fierce glimmer in her large eyes that exerted pressure on the person she was speaking to, depriving them of the opportunity to look at her with any ill will. "It's true that he's a regular customer, but I don't see him outside of work." That photograph was taken when we both happened to be walking in the direction of the club and bumped into one another on the street. I don't deny that I'm expecting no. I don't intend to make the father's name public, but when I become a mother, I'm planning to hand over the club entirely to the girls working there. I intend to step back from the world of entertainment and go into beauty treatment. The dignity with which she made this announcement struck Rika. And yet, although the article that the editorial desk wrote up from Rika's report preserved some of this statement, they omitted the part where she denied the courtship, and molded the story into the kind of sex scandal about a major politician deemed fit to grace the front page of the first Shumi weekly of the year. The relaxed time she'd enjoyed on New Year's Day soon disappeared without a trace under an onslaught of one hectic day after another, and she didn't even have time for the nanakusage, rice porridge containing 7 spring herbs, that it was traditional to eat on the morning of the 7th. "At least I'll be getting out of the office for lunch today," Rika thought as she struck the enter key with a force that immediately made her embarrassed. "Rika, have you put on weight?" Hearing the mocking tone of the question, not by any means the first today, Rika turned around in exasperation. Now even Kitamura, who as a rule showed zero interest in other people, was talking to her about her weight, with evident surprise on his face. "How did you manage to gain so much weight when you barely took any time off?" The fact that what he was saying was spot on made her even less inclined to reply. In all likelihood, she had been accruing fat since before the turn of the year. Then there were all the mochi her mother had given her, which she'd been tucking into as a nightly snack. She had, of course, been faintly aware of the changes to her body. There was a heaviness around her jawline, and her breasts had got bigger, so that the underwiring of her bra felt tight. She could see the fat gleaming pale and white on her lower abdomen. Having a sense of what was happening, she got on the scales kept in the medical office at work, only to find that she weighed more than she had ever done. Unable to believe it at first, she'd stepped on and off the scales repeatedly. The text that she'd received late last night from Makoto also irked her. "Have you put on a few pounds?" He'd followed this up with a sticker of an anime character slapping their hands to their cheeks and screaming. Rika had felt a flicker of anger. If he'd caught sight of her at work, he could at least have said hello. Alone in her apartment, she felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "It's probably because you've been eating that stodgy pasta late at night. Still, what's done is done. Just watch yourself now and you'll be fine." What did he mean, you'll be fine? This was the first time since they'd started dating that Makoto, who could barely summon the enthusiasm to send a Happy New Year text message, was showing such strength of conviction. "Hey, you can hardly talk." Your belly's huge these days, thanks to all that drinking. You've started snoring and everything. Men putting on weight is different from women putting on weight, though. I'm only saying this for your sake, Rika. She knew from his tone that he was angry. She didn't reply. This morning another message had arrived from him, hammering the point home. I'm being deliberately harsh when I say this, but for the record, I definitely don't think it's a good idea for you to put on weight. I haven't got fixed ideas about the way women should look or anything, but if people around you think you're not making an effort, you'll lose their respect. Putting a forcible end to the task she'd begun, Rika slung on her coat and dashed out to Kagurazaka. The short jog to reach her destination on time made her break out in a light sweat all over her body. She wondered if this might help her shift some weight. Reiko was already sitting on the cafe terrace that looked out across the moat in front of Idabashi Station, drinking a cup of herbal tea. With an appointment at the maternity clinic she'd started attending in Suedobashi, she'd got in touch to ask Rika to lunch if she could find the time. Her hair, worn loose over her soft chestnut-colored jumper, had the luster of a woman with time to devote to her appearance, and just the sight of it calmed Rika's heart. The two wished one another a happy new year, spread out the menus in front of them, and quickly placed their orders. Sorry to make you come out all the way to my part of town, Rika said. Don't apologize. I've got time on my hands. I'm happy to come to you. Reiko was sneaking glances at the man in a suit slurping pasta at the next table. Rika cocked her head inquisitively. He tried to light up a cigarette and got told off by a female customer, Reiko whispered. She was so harsh, I felt sorry for him. The sharing dishes look exactly like ashtrays, so it's hardly his fault if he got confused. Even as a non-smoker, I feel like this new anti-smoking drive is a bit extreme. Rika saw that the man was slumped over the table, lifting his fork to his mouth in a slightly forlorn manner. The doctor I went to see today has a reputation as the infertility expert. The surgery doesn't take reservations, so you have to wait at least 3 or 4 hours. When I gave my name at reception, they told me to come back in 2 hours' time. Wow, they're that popular? When's your next appointment? If you tell me, I can keep that day free. I'd love it if we could start having lunch regularly. I think it'll depend on what happens today. It's all down to when you ovulate, so sometimes you're told to come back the following day. It was a right pain when I was still working. Having to take several afternoons a month off causes all sorts of problems for your colleagues, obviously. In that sense, it's good to have more time on my hands than I know what to do with. It was the first time Rika had heard Reiko admit to having too much time. Taken by surprise, she was unsure how to respond. Sorry, I shouldn't talk like that. It's bad form when I'm the one who chose to stop working. Forget I said it. What's been going on with you? Even if they only had a short time in each other's company, Rika would have liked to ask Reiko more. With the conversation now directed at her, though, she made a confession of her own. Actually, I've been taking Manako Kajii's advice and eating like crazy, and in the process I've put on 5 kilos. I currently weigh 54 kilos. Fighting back her embarrassment, she confided to her friend what everyone in the office was gossiping about. Reiko tilted her head and scrutinized Rika. Now you mention it, I can see you've filled out a little. But how tall are you again? 5 feet 3. At that height, 54 kilos isn't even plump. The beauty standards in the mass media are crazily exacting. If it's bothering you, though, why don't you try exercising to make up for the extra food you're eating? I'd recommend weight training rather than aerobic exercise. You're so sporty, you'll easily be able to shed a couple of kilos and enjoy yourself in the process. Then you'll not just be slim, but really toned. Where Makoto's suggestion had caused a visceral reaction in her, Reiko's advice made its way inside her frictionlessly. Reiko was right, the situation wasn't yet beyond repair. She just had to take a look at her lifestyle and make gradual adjustments. From this vantage point, it suddenly seemed strange to think that she'd lost her confidence and been so thrown by a few offhand comments. Still, Manako Kajii must be quite something. To change the habits of someone like you, you'd give a cave-dwelling hermit a run for their money. For better or worse, she must have heaps of charisma. It makes me want to meet her. I'm trying to imagine you two together, and all I can see is a pit viper and a mongoose at each other's throats. I can't think for a second that you'd get on. Why not? Are you saying I'm savage enough to rival a convicted serial killer? At this, Reiko puffed out her cheeks sulkily, and Rika giggled. You wouldn't know it to look at her, but Reiko was especially adept at getting her own way, often in defiance of the people around her. Her love of food, also, matched Kajii's in its ardency. Rika couldn't imagine that Kajii, who needed to be in pole position at all times, would ever open her heart to Reiko. Perhaps, she thought now, it was precisely her own lack of sexiness, of in fact any kind of intensity, that allowed Kajii to relax and let go of her compulsion to compete with those around her. Anyway, we live in an age where knowing what's a good amount for you gets a bad rap. Same with the smoker from before. A good amount? Reiko reached out and drew the sugar pot closer to her, sprinkling half a teaspoonful into her cup. You know how in recipes it'll say sugar to taste, or a good amount of salt, and so on. A friend of mine who edits cookery books for a living said that they've started having complaints about recipes that leave things to the individual's discretion. She thinks it's because people are increasingly worried about making mistakes and losing faith in their own judgment. They don't know what a good amount looks like for them. When in fact, cooking is all about trial and error. This is hard to hear. I think I'm probably that type too. Reiko set her cup down on the table and smiled, then looked towards the chuoline tracks that ran along the other side of the moat. Every time Rika saw her, Reiko seemed to have shrunk a fraction, as if she were a grain of rice whose outside layers were being gradually polished away. It was less that she looked unhealthy and more as though, little by little, she was reverting to her younger self. There was no difference between the person sitting before her now and the 18-year-old Rika had first met. She didn't know if that was a good thing or not. Nobody has to be fully satisfied by just one thing, and nor do they have to aim to be like everyone else. It's plenty if people can enjoy things a good amount and be satisfied with their life overall. Enjoying a cigarette after a meal is okay, and putting on a little weight isn't anything to merit fussing about. I guess some would see that as a slacker's take, though. With this final line, Reiko cocked her head. Rika wanted to reach out and squeeze her pale hand. Neither she nor Reiko had really changed. Rather than making her happy, the fact seemed tinged with pathos. But that means knowing what's a good amount for you personally. Right. Which is why you may need to eat all sorts of different foods and find the tastes and the body size that work for you. Hey, why don't we make a habit of having lunch together and try out new restaurants together? There's loads of good places in this neighborhood. I think it's so great that you've had your eyes open to the wonders of good food. I suppose I have Kajimana to thank for that. I like that idea. I'll try expanding the boundaries of my taste buds a little at a time. The pasta and salad they'd ordered arrived. The surface of the moat spread out in front of them was calm, absorbing the high blue January sky. Mochi with butter? That sounds scrumptious. Despite the intensity of its flavor, butter can accommodate any ingredient, and I imagine it would make a seamless combination with warm, softly stretching mochi. As she spoke, Kajii's eyes moistened and her lips took on a dull sheen. It was the first time Rika had seen her since the new year. The Oshi had apparently been to her satisfaction, and no sooner had Rika inquired about them that Kajii started in on her detailed assessment. The Nishim vegetable stew had not been a triumph, but the curry kintan weren't bad, and so on. In this manner, Rika was able to broach the subject of New Year's meals in the house where Kajii had grown up. What makes mochi delicious is the way that, beneath that endless surface of soft, plump skin, the mochi rice still retains a vestige of its former shape and grazes roughly along the tongue. I remember how, back at home, we would roast kiritanpo skewers and eat them with butter and soy sauce. With kiritanpo, the granular texture of the rice is deliberately preserved during the pounding, and it's then molded onto cedar sticks. The way the textures on the tongue alternate between chewy and abrasive is thrilling. When you add the use of butter to that, it's just Observing the sensual way that Kajii squirmed inside, the prison officer standing behind her shifted his eyes uncomfortably. Rika found herself saying, "Thanks to all those mochi I ate, though, my colleagues are teasing me for having put on weight. I'm thinking about how best to lose it." A shadow descended across the plump, pale face on the other side of the acrylic screen. The crease in her chin deepened and was joined by others. There is nothing in this world so pathetic, so moronic, so meaningless as dieting. Damn, I've blown it, Rika thought. She could have kicked herself. The door which had begun to open in front of her was now slammed shut. My mother was a truly ignorant woman who was utterly fixated on dieting and demanded the same of her daughters. A woman with a cold, impoverished soul and not a trace of femininity about her, who ignored her own husband to pursue her trifling hobbies, her social activities, and her work. An utterly miserable creature. Not an iota of charm about her. My father can't ever have been loved in a way that truly satisfied him. Hearing Kajii alluding to her parents' sex lives with perfect equanimity left Rika a touch startled. She felt certain that this was an important pronouncement Kajii was making. If her memory served her correctly, Kajii had become tight-lipped in court whenever the subject had turned to her mother. For what purpose, exactly, do you want to lose weight? Are you worried about not being attractive to men? Because in that case, you have nothing to fear. Men are naturally attracted to shapely, full-figured women. When I say men, I'm of course referring to real men who are emotionally mature, affluent, and capable of generosity. Men who favor women with bodies like skinny children are the ones with no confidence in themselves. They're without exception servile, sexually and emotionally immature, with no capacity for financial generosity, either. Kajii simply didn't permit the people who wouldn't accept her into her field of vision. That was how she was able to remain so full of confidence. The scent of camphor that clung to her was one unique to women who had only dated older, affluent men. The reason that Rika couldn't feel any envy towards her, however much her blog flaunted her luxurious way of living, was that it all seemed to belong to a bygone age, wealth as a codified form of belief in the dominance of the rich and powerful. No, I'm not particularly bothered about how men see me. This is a very mainstream view that I'm expressing, so please don't take offense, but here in Japan, it's thought that it's beautiful to be thin. It's better for your health, and clothes look more flattering on you that way. You should read Madame de Pompadour. Wasn't she the lover of Marie Antoinette's grandfather? You people working in the media all graduate from good universities, and yet you don't know a thing, do you? Even this mocking tone of Kajii's didn't grate on Rika. It came as a surprise to her, but she was starting to enjoy Kajii speaking to her in this condescending way. She was a noble woman who became Louis XV's chief mistress. She mused constantly about how to soothe the spirits of the king, so ground down by the war as they were. She educated herself in all kinds of disciplines and came up with wonderful ideas on practically a daily basis. She invited men of letters to the palace, thereby originating salon culture. She produced plays, treading the boards herself and convincing the royal family about the joys of acting. She became a connoisseur of wine and created the trend for selecting wines based on their region of origin. Many of her innovations form indispensable elements of French cuisine as we know it today. Rika found herself rapt by Kajii's speech. In a different way from Reiko, Kajii opened up a new world to her, expanding her perspective. She thought to herself that she would try gathering material about Madame de Pompadour. At the same time, she felt the story had a common thread with her mother's tale of the matchmaking party. At the end of the day, men were not looking for a real-life woman, but a professional entertainer. What lay behind Madame de Pompadour's actions wasn't any personal ambition or desire to show off. Her enduring innovations came from an earnest desire to devote herself to someone else, from a natural, feminine kindness. While Rika hated to admit it, she knew that what people would be talking about 100 years from now would not be the articles she had busted a gut to write, but Manako Kajii and her case. This was no time to withdraw, though. She had to find a way of writing up this interaction between her and Kajii, which had been going on now for a month. She thought about how to broach the subject with Kajii. She'd have to wait for the right moment, then ask Kajii if she'd consent to being featured in an interview, so long as its content had nothing to do with her case. Her retrial would begin in spring. Are you listening to me? Rika was pulled back to the cramped visiting room by Kajii's imperious voice. In the same way that real men understand the beauty of a full-bodied woman, real French cuisine uses oodles of butter. Present-day Japan, enamored by phrases like low on sweetness, low in calories, light, and simple tasting, wouldn't know the real thing if it hit them in the face. Preferring simple tasting food once you know how good butter can be, I can just about forgive. But these people can't even tell the difference between butter and margarine. For women like me, who are only interested in the real thing, it's unbearable. You too, though. It's imperative that you taste classic, orthodox French cuisine at least once. I suggest Joel Robuchon in Ebisu. Is that the one in Ebisu Garden Place that looks like the Disneyland castle? Rika asked unthinkingly, surprised by the appearance of this familiar name. Perhaps feeling that she'd been looked down on, Kajii pulled a huffish face. That's right. With these sorts of things, the orthodox choice is the safest route. I used to be taken there often on dates. I believe I went there 2 or 3 times with Mr. Yamamura. Rika felt sweat forming between her fingers. It was the first time the name of one of her victims emerged from Kajii's mouth. This was why she'd spent the last month gorging on butter, like someone possessed, she thought to herself. Tokio Yamamura, who had fallen under a train in November 2013, was the final victim in Kajii's case, a single man of 42 who worked in one of the country's most prominent think tanks. He'd met Kajii in July of that year on a matchmaking site, and the two had immediately started dating with a view to getting married. Not only was he younger than Kajii's other victims, but as a keen train spotter, he was also something of a well-known figure online. His knowledge of the odaku and hankyu lines, which he trotted out on his blog, was viewed as unrivaled in its thoroughness. He lived with his mother in central Tokyo, but when he started dating Kajii, he moved into his own apartment with a good view of the tracks near a station on the odaku line. Photographs of him showed a man with a slender, boyish build. His clean-shaven face and polo shirt, with its neatly ironed collar, gave the impression of a meticulous character. Was Mr. Yamamura knowledgeable about French cuisine? Not in the slightest. He didn't know the first thing about wine, and he'd never even eaten game before. He would often lapse into silence, a troubled expression on his face, which was highly embarrassing. He wasn't the kind to savor conversation or cuisine, but I could sense his earnestness and loyalty to me. Rika could see that if she didn't intervene, Kajii's boasting would continue indefinitely. She decided to go on the offensive, armed with a key piece of intel. If I remember rightly, this is the person who mistook your beef bourguignon for beef stew, am I right? I looked it up and discovered that in French, beef bourguignon means beef done in a Burgundy style. In other words, stewed in red wine. I have to say, I don't feel like it's such a terrible error for someone who knows little about cooking to call it beef stew. No sooner were the words beef bourguignon out of her mouth than Rika saw Kajii's expression change dramatically. It was as Reiko said, her spirits soared at the very mention of food. It was unexpectedly easy to manipulate her feelings. But in Japan, the words beef stew refer to a different dish altogether. Beef bourguignon is the very first dish we learned to make at Le Salon de Mayuko. I made it for Mr. Yamamura as a sign of my gratitude to him for allowing me to frequent the school. Once again, Reiko's intuition had proved correct. Perhaps everything led back to that cooking school in Nishiazabu and to that group of women. Then, to cap it all, he said he wanted to eat it not with bread, but with rice. Kajii shook her glossy wavy hair as if in disgust. But it seems he appreciated the food you made for him, no? He texted his mother before he died to tell her about the meal, saying how delicious it was. It was less that he understood the taste of the dishes I prepared, and more that he simply wanted to take his meals by my side. He used to often say, I'd sooner die than end up living a solitary life eating takeaway bento boxes by myself. This again, Rika thought. For Kajii's victims there seemed to be only 2 types of meal, the warm, comforting kind eaten at a dinner table clustered with dishes lovingly prepared by a woman's patient hands, and the sad, lonely takeaway meals for one. Why so extreme in their thinking? Even if they were alone, even if they were eating food from the convenience store, it only took a little bit of imagination and application to transform the moment into a pleasurable one. Also, while these men seemed obsessed by food and meals, their understanding of taste was totally undeveloped. They didn't know what a good amount was for themselves either. Rika decided to air these doubts with Kajii. How did you manage to make such delicious meals for men whom you had no intention of being with long term? Wasn't it a bore? You really don't understand anything, do you? Rika was sure that she heard Kajii click her tongue. It gives me pleasure to give men pleasure. It's not work, at least as you conceive of it. Caring for, supporting, and warming the hearts of men is women's God-given role, and, without fail, performing it makes women beautiful. They become goddesses. Don't you see? You find so many hard, spiky women these days because they lack love towards men and are unsatisfied as a result. You have to understand that women can never hope to rival men's power. That's nothing to be ashamed of. When you acknowledge the differences between the sexes, when you accept men for how they are and work to support and please them, a future of freedom and abundance awaits you. Everyone is suffering because they're trying to rail against the natural order of things. As she spoke, Kajii's face was contorted by a violent anger and frustration at odds with the content of what she was saying. Her mouth and nose took up unusual positions, giving her a wholly different face to the one that Rika had become accustomed to. Her eyes grew bloodshot, and her irises startlingly dark. Women's obsession with work and independence and so on is the source of their dissatisfaction. When women surpass men, their chance for romance slips away from them. Men and women alike need to understand that they can't find happiness without each other. If you scrimp on butter, your food will taste inferior, and if you scrimp on femininity and a wish to serve your partner, then your relationships will grow impoverished. Why can't you fathom that? My case is attracting this much attention precisely because there are so many totally misguided women out there. They can't bear to see me acting so uninhibitedly. Growing more and more heated, Kajii began enunciating the end of her sentences with great force. Rika was surprised to hear her refer to how others were perceiving her. She had thought Kajii barely registered such things. "That's why you're worthless, all of you," she howled, her face a deep tomato red. "That's the end of the meeting," barked the prison officer as he came rushing over, restraining Kajii. She had entirely forsaken her usual affected composure. Her nostrils flared and her shoulders heaved up and down as she breathed. Noticing Rika staring at her astonished, Kajii seemed to come back to herself. "I'm tired," she murmured. For a while, Rika found herself unable to get to her feet. When she finally stood and passed down the long corridor and out of the detention house, the sight of the buildings with no sign of any life inside struck her as even more bleak than usual. The flowers placed by the guardrail had been replaced again with fresh ones. Pheasant's eyes, Rika wasn't at all good with flowers, but she had a sense that was what they were called. They were the New Year's flower. In order to have sufficient time and money at your disposal and to generally enjoy yourself while serving as an entertainer for men, and to do this so well that you never once presented them with a glimpse of what went on behind the scenes, you needed to treat the role as your career, as Kajii had done. You had to give up working, give up being a mother. Even Momo Oyasu, the ultimate professional, had decided to throw it all away and brave the world alone the moment she became a mother. On the one hand, you had the men seeking a professional, and on the other, women looking for a partner to share their life with. Sensing the sheer depth of the rift existing between the two positions, Rika felt dizzy. But men weren't all like that, she tried telling herself. Think of Makoto. But then she remembered their recent message exchange and felt as if she had accidentally crunched a mouthful of sand. What was it that Makoto wanted if not a woman slender as a board who never said anything troublesome, didn't tie him down, and wasn't in any way too much for him? Would he not, in fact, drop her with surprising abruptness if she failed to meet even one of those requirements? Rika didn't want to believe it. She wanted to think that Makoto wasn't the kind of man to force a particular role on a woman. She'd fallen for him because he was someone with whom she could share her feelings. When the two of them had first met, they'd spent hours talking about their childhoods and their favorite books. Every time they found things they had in common, the sparkle in his eyes would grow brighter. There she went, reminiscing on the early stages of their relationship again. She found it impossible to picture their future in a way that seemed appealing. But this loss of confidence in their relationship was surely the result of their spending so little time together, so that her sense of him as a person was starting to fade. This year, she said to herself, she'd make an effort to see as much of him as possible. Effort, effort, effort. This word that seemed to attach itself to her every waking hour, as pervasive as a curse. How could she try any harder than she already was? She barely ever saw her family, or her boyfriend, or her best friend. She took one day off for the New Year break. Even after Reiko's advice, she was finding it hard to create the time to exercise. This lunchtime, being mindful of her calorie consumption, she'd shoveled down a seaweed salad that she hadn't even wanted to eat. Cold seaweed on a midwinter day had chilled her to the core. Was the future that Rika dreamed of for herself exactly the kind of thing Kajii had been warning against? Would becoming the first woman to make the editorial desk make men fear her? Could she become strong enough to genuinely no longer care what men thought of her? She didn't understand how you were supposed to decide how much was enough. She had no idea what a good amount for her would be. Rika took out her smartphone and put in a call to the Joel Robuchon. Asked how many people her reservation was for, she hesitated, then requested a table for one, for dinner next week. She would have loved to go with Reiko, but it seemed cruel to ask her out to a costly dinner when she wasn't working. Asking her mother was fraught, too, when she was busy caring for Rika's grandfather on weeknights. She suspected Makoto wouldn't want to go either. The atmosphere in those kinds of places set him on edge, and she thought he might well complain about the rich, buttery taste of the food. If she was going to fork out that kind of money, then she would ideally sit opposite someone with whom she could fully share the experience. If that was impossible, then she didn't mind going alone. She knew this way of thinking couldn't be further from Kajii's conviction that when eating out it was essential to have a male companion. Rika felt that a boyfriend was someone you should meet only at those times your needs perfectly corresponded. She was pretty sure that Makoto felt the same. So really, we're in the same boat, Rika thought as she raised an arm to hail a taxi. The cold wind coming off the river stung the inside of her nose and slapped at her cheeks, instructing her, make an effort. But be sure not to surpass everybody else while you're at it. Out of the corner of her eye, she thought she saw the pheasant's eyes wavering about in a gust of wind.